Hello, my name is Dr. Tim Stratton. I'm a little under the weather today, but I'm going to do my best to bring to you the free-thinking argument against naturalism. Have you ever heard of the term free thinker? Well, atheists love to label themselves as free thinkers because they claim to have no restraints to follow the facts wherever they lead. I once read a newspaper article where a free thinker, an atheist, stated that a modern-day atheist is someone who has heard the claims of various religions, has read the books on which those claims are based, and has found the claims to be ridiculous. Well, there's a huge problem with this statement. If these atheists happen to be right that God does not exist, then it's also highly implausible that the immaterial or supernatural aspect of humanity called a soul exists. In fact, the vast majority of these modern-day atheists affirm a view known as naturalism. In a nutshell, naturalism is the view that only nature exists. Only the kinds of stuff that scientists can possibly test or discover, according to the naturalist, is all that actually exists. This means that these free thinkers begin with the presupposition that the supernatural does not exist. So God or things like God do not exist. Well, this has led me to the conclusion that it's impossible for an atheistic naturalist to really be a free thinker. I mean, sure, they can join the club and call themselves free thinkers, but if they happen to be right about the non-existence of God and the human soul created in God's likeness, then no one could freely think anything. This led me to think logically about what it really means to be a free thinker. And in the process, I crafted an argument I call the free thinking argument against naturalism. Now, this argument specifically focuses on what follows if all things about humanity are causally determined and necessitated by previous antecedent conditions, like the forces and events of nature. Even if there's some indeterminacy in the quantum realm, all of this would causally determine everything about humanity, everything about you, everything about me. So remember, by the word nature, I am referring to the kinds of stuff that scientists can test or discover. Let's look at this argument here. It says 4 premises, 3 deductive conclusions, and 1 abductive conclusion. Premise 1. If naturalism is true, then only nature exists, right? No souls, no angels, no demons, no God. 2. If there is no supernatural aspect of humanity, then everything about humanity, including all thoughts and beliefs, would be causally determined by the forces and events of nature, such as physics and chemistry. Premise 3. If all things about humanity, including all thoughts and beliefs, are causally determined by the forces and events of nature, then it is impossible for humans to rationally infer better or best explanations over false beliefs and rationally affirm knowledge claims. I'll say that premise one more time. Premise 3. If all things about humanity, including all thoughts and beliefs, are causally determined by the forces and events of nature, then it's impossible for humans to rationally infer better or best explanations over false beliefs and rationally affirm knowledge claims. Premise 4. It is possible for humans to infer better and best explanations over false beliefs and rationally affirm knowledge claims. 5. Therefore, not all things about humanity are causally determined by the forces and events of nature. 6. Therefore, a supernatural aspect of humanity exists, like a soul or immaterial mind, or call it whatever you'd like. 7. Therefore, naturalism is false because souls or immaterial minds or something like that exists. 8. Abductive conclusion. Speaking of the inference to the best explanation, The best explanation of the existence of a supernatural aspect of humanity is God, and the biblical view of God seems to make the most sense. All right, let's talk about this argument. The first three steps of the argument are rather straightforward. To quickly explain each premise, let's start with the first. If naturalism is true, then only nature exists, right? There's no souls, angels, demons, or God. Okay, premise one, that's true by definition. If naturalism is true, nature is all that exists. Now, look, if atheists hold that things outside of nature exist, which they can do, well, then they're admitting that naturalism is false and, in effect, agreeing with the theist that not only does nature exist, but so does the supernatural, things other than nature. Now, this is a move that the one who is committed to atheistic presuppositions probably doesn't want to make, because God, if he exists, falls into the supernatural category. So by admitting that anything supernatural exists, one tacitly admits at least the plausibility or the possibility of God's existence. Like the biblical view of God, by definition, the human soul is not a physical or material type of thing. It's an immaterial and supernatural aspect of human existence, which, if it exists, leads to some tremendous conclusions. If the soul does not exist, however, that leads to our second premise. So the second premise states, if there is no supernatural aspect of humanity, then everything about humanity, including all thoughts and all beliefs, would be causally determined by the forces and events of nature, like physics and chemistry. So premise two is tantamount to the following. If all that exists is nature, then everything about humanity is causally determined by the forces of nature, the initial conditions of the Big Bang, perhaps some quantum events, all things which are outside of human control, all things that are outside of your control. So for the sake of simplicity, this premise is virtually synonymous with this statement. If nature is all that exists, then all is causally determined by the laws and events of nature. Now, this is not a premise that I need to defend. Why is that? Well, because so many others do it for me. In fact, most of the respected famous atheists in the world will do that for me. They'll defend this premise for me. The vast majority of naturalists and atheists agree with this premise. Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Lawrence Krauss, Jerry Coyne, Alex Rosenberg, Sean Carroll, the late Will Provine, the late Stephen Hawking, right? I could go on and on and on. They will all, and they have, defended this premise for me. But here's the rub. If this kind of free will does not exist, then choices and actions and even many of our beliefs are not really up to us. Rather, our choices, actions, and beliefs are forced upon us, causally determined and necessitated by external sources. So that's to say that your thoughts and beliefs are forced upon you by non-rational things that are not you. So let's look at a couple of famous naturalists that you've heard of. I've mentioned Stephen Hawking. Let's see what he said. He says, "It is hard to imagine how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems that we are no more than biological machines and that free will is just an illusion." Hawking concludes that human behavior is indeed determined by the laws of nature, and our actions are as determined as the orbits of the planets. The famous new atheist philosopher, neuroscientist, and best-selling author Sam Harris agrees. In his book about free will, entitled Free Will, Harris writes, quote, "Free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. Free will is actually more than an illusion, or less, in that it cannot be made conceptually coherent. Either our wills this would include our thoughts and beliefs, right? Either our wills are determined by prior causes and we are not responsible for them, or they are the product of chance and we are not responsible for them. End quote. Well, it's comforting to see the consistency of many of the world's most famous atheists when it comes to the denial of free will. However, I don't think they've taken their beliefs to their logical conclusions. This is the case because if their determined beliefs just so happen to correspond to reality, it seems as if they could never know it. Well, let's go to the next premise, and I'll explain why. The third premise goes as follows. If all things about humanity, including all thoughts and beliefs, are causally determined by the forces and events of nature, then it's impossible for humans to rationally infer better or best explanations over false beliefs and rationally affirm knowledge claims. Now, premise 3 expresses the following fact: that if all things about humanity are causally determined by something other than humanity, then that includes all thoughts, all beliefs, all evaluations, and all judgments. Well, that's a problem. Think about it. If all of a person's thoughts, beliefs, evaluations, and judgments are always forced upon her, and she had no opportunity to be more careful and choose better thoughts, beliefs, evaluations, or judgments, then she's simply left assuming that her determined thoughts, beliefs, evaluations, and judgments are good and that her beliefs are true. It's just an assumption. Indeed, her mind and the events in her mind are not up to her. She's nothing but a passive cog at the mercy of the whims of non-thinking physics and chemistry. Therefore, one could never rationally affirm that her beliefs really are the inference to the best explanation. This can only be assumed, and this assumption would likewise be causally determined and forced upon her. She has no control over it. A sense of vertigo is warranted. Speaking of a sense of vertigo, William Lane Craig makes the following point. He says, quote, "There is a sort of dizzying, self-defeating character to determinism. For if one comes to believe that determinism is true, one has to believe that the reason he's come to believe it is simply that he was determined to do so. One has not been able to weigh the arguments pro and con and freely make up one's mind on that basis. The difference between the person who weighs the arguments for determinism and rejects them and the person who weighs them and accepts them is wholly that one was determined by causal factors outside himself to believe and the other not to believe. When you come to realize that your decision to believe in determinism was itself determined, and that even your present realization of that fact right now is likewise determined, a sort of vertigo sets in. For everything that you think, even this very thought itself, is outside your control. Determinism could be true, but it's very hard to see how it could ever be rationally affirmed, since its affirmation undermines the rationality of its affirmation." End quote. The assumption that the non-rational laws and events of nature causally determine all human thoughts, evaluations, and judgments is the paramount concern for the atheistic naturalist who affirms the exhaustive determinism of humanity. Indeed, this provides an undercutting defeater to the determinists' belief in determinism. Their belief is no longer justified since there's an undercutting defeater. Thus, if determinism is true, then atheists, or anyone else for that matter, cannot possess justification for their belief in atheism or naturalism. And if justification is required for knowledge, which the majority of epistemologists affirm, then the atheist or naturalist cannot possess knowledge based upon justification either. It follows that if the naturalist knows that naturalism is true, then naturalism is false. Okay, the first three premises have been explained and supported, providing us great reason to think they are true. We have justification for each of the three premises, the first three premises. Now, this brings us to the final premise, premise 4, which virtually no one wants to reject. All right, what is it? It says, it is possible for humans to infer better and best explanations over false beliefs and to rationally affirm knowledge claims. Now, I want you to see why no one wants to reject this pivotal premise. It's because it's self-defeating to offer knowledge claims against this premise. Dr. Jim Slagle, a philosopher, says, quote, there's no alternative. Our own rationality is our starting point. It is the presupposition with which we must begin any inquiry, including an inquiry into whether we are rational. So think about it. If someone says, I know that I do not know anything, they've just refuted their own statement. It must be false. If someone says, after considering the data, the inference to the best explanation is that no one can ever infer the best explanation. Well, that's ridiculous, because the one rejecting this premise assumed the truth of the premise. Surely premise 4 is true. At the least, it's impossible to rationally deny it. So, with all 4 premises in place, 3 deductive conclusions follow. All right, step 5 says, therefore, not all things about humanity are causally determined by the forces and events of nature. Step 6, therefore, a supernatural aspect of humanity exists, like a soul or an immaterial mind. And 7, therefore, naturalism is false. Souls or immaterial minds exist. So, we've discussed the ability and a seemingly supernatural power, as it were, to infer better and best explanations over false beliefs. Well, with best explanations in mind, what is the best explanation of this supernatural aspect of humanity? I contend that the best explanation of a supernatural aspect of humanity is the supernatural cause and creator of all natural reality. That is to say, the cause and creator of the universe. Now, if you'll notice, I've not touched a Bible or any religious book up until this point. I based my entire argument on logic alone. But again, what is the best explanation of an immaterial supernatural mind or a supernatural soul? Well, since naturalistic evolution seems to be an unlikely, if not impossible, candidate to account for the existence of the immaterial and supernatural mind or soul, a better explanation is required. In fact, it seems that we need an ultimate supernatural and immaterial mind or soul to account for the contingent existence of the human soul. So, do we have any reason to think that an ultimate soul exists? Do we have any evidence of an ultimate soul? Well, I'm glad you asked. Yes, we do. The Kalam cosmological argument. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, although the word God is not found in the premises or the conclusion, the Kalam cosmological argument is one of the most popular arguments for God's existence because theism is rationally inferred from the deductive conclusion, at least once the word universe is properly defined. Now, consider the rational inferences that logically follow from the deductive conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument. The cause of all space, time, and nature must be spaceless, timeless, and other than nature, right? Supernatural. Moreover, the cause of the universe must be enormously powerful to create an entire universe from nothing. I mean, could anything require more power? Additionally, not only did the cause of the universe have to have been apart from time and space, it also must have had the ability, the power to spontaneously bring the world into existence without anything causing it to do so, because then whatever the cause of the cause was would be the cause. But since this cause exists outside of anything physical, temporal, or material, none of these things could logically cause or force this ultimate cause to do anything. Therefore, this ultimate cause seems to have its own volition or libertarian freedom to create or not to create the universe. So apart from anything abstract, which would be causally impotent anyway, only an unembodied mind or a soul could logically transcend space-time and all nature. If this line of thinking were taken further, then would it not lead to the conclusion that persons are the only type of thing or things that could possibly possess immaterial minds with free will, which is supported by the free thinking argument I previously offered? Therefore, a person can decipher that the cause of the universe was a personal being. Now look, if the cause of the universe is personal, then it's at least possible that it, whatever it is, can have a personal relationship with other personal beings. And humans are personal beings. Therefore, it's possible that humans can have a personal relationship with the cause of the universe. Wow. I mean, look, no special revelation or biblical data required. I didn't touch a Bible, right? But I want you to see something here. We've reached this logical conclusion without touching a Bible. But guess what? The Bible affirms all that we've just concluded. Perhaps that's good reason to take the Bible seriously. Although I have not touched a Bible to make my case, since we have concluded that we ought to take the Bible seriously, I have good reason to touch the Bible now. So let's see what it says. The Bible tells us that there is a non-physical and supernatural creator of all nature. John 4:24 makes it clear that God is not a physical or material type of thing. No, it says God is spirit. Moreover, Genesis 1, John 1, and Colossians 1 are all clear that this non-physical being created all other things that actually exist. So we see here that if God exists, and we have really good reason to think he does exist, right? We see here that if God exists, then we have a supernatural soul or an immaterial mind behind the universe. It therefore makes sense to have many minds within the universe, the mega mind created, right? So the biblical view of God makes this quite clear. Genesis 1 26 and 27 says, let us make man in our image. And then 2 Corinthians 5:8, let's go to the New Testament. Paul says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, right? So the thing that you are can exist apart from your body, right? You are not your body. You have a body, but you are a soul that has a body. So look, we reached our conclusions without the Bible, but we see here that the Bible is telling us everything we've reached through logic. So perhaps we should choose to take the Bible seriously. We should go to Scripture and see what it says. Ultimately, if God and soul do not exist, we are not free to choose anything. And that includes what we are going to choose to believe or think. A naturalistic atheist has no right to call himself a free thinker. I think a better name for these atheistic free thinkers would be the determined determinists, because given naturalism, there's no freedom to think otherwise. Christians, however, have the right to call themselves free thinkers. Here's the bottom line. The supernatural must exist for the naturalistic atheist to freely think that it doesn't. It makes much more sense to conclude that naturalism is false and that God and things like God, such as souls, exist. So if you believe that you are a rational free thinker who is not ultimately mind controlled by something else, then you should reject atheistic naturalism and affirm that both God and soul exist. Christian theism is the best explanation of all the data. Thank you. God bless, and stay reasonable.